This is Invested in Climate with Jason Rissman. I see climate as the world's biggest, most diverse, most important movement in human history. Millions of people dedicate themselves every day to protecting the planet. This podcast shares conversations with advocates, entrepreneurs, investors, policy experts, and anyone else that can push our thinking about what's possible and what needs to happen to address climate change. If you have ideas for episodes or feedback, get in touch on LinkedIn. If you enjoy the show, please leave a rating on Apple or Spotify. I'm currently building a new venture. It's related to storytelling and how we engage all sorts of folks in meaningful climate action. If you have expertise in this area, big ideas, or examples of something that's really working, get in touch. Thanks for listening and for doing whatever it is you're doing to support climate progress. Okay, let's get started.
I call it the raisin bread theory, that the bread is the makeup influencer talking about makeup. And then it's the raisins of like, okay, occasionally when they're putting on that makeup, they're talking about how silly it is that we're still hooked on these fuels and we're importing this volatility into our bills. And like, wouldn't it be better if we switched and had homegrown energy and got out of this chaos of this hamster wheel that we're in? So that's kind of our theory. It's like, give people what they want. It's the entertainment and joy of experiencing the internet, and slip that message within culture, operate within culture. And that kind of really, really worked for us.
Hi, everyone. Most people assume the main barrier to clean energy in America is technology or cost. Neither is true anymore. The sun is cheap, the wind is free, the turbines work. What doesn't work is the system we've built around them. Between 70 and 90% of renewable energy projects started in the US never reach construction. The ones that survive face a gauntlet of federal reviews, local ordinances, interconnection queues stretching years, and organized opposition campaigns funded by interests that don't want to see the grid change. We're talking about over 2,000 gigawatts of clean energy projects sitting in line, waiting to plug into the grid. And that's enough to power the country many times over. Today's guest is doing something about this problem. GoodPower is a nonprofit organization using research, strategic communications, campaigns, and even technology to accelerate the transition to renewable energy around the world. In this conversation, I'm joined by Leah Qusba, GoodPower's CEO, who has been with the organization for almost 17 years. We spoke about GoodPower's history and evolution, its work-changing culture, building political power, accelerating an economy that works for all, and much more. Leah reflects a fast-growing school of thought. Call it the abundance mindset, after Derek Thompson and Ezra Klein's influential book that sees future-forward infrastructure as the key to unlocking tremendous economic opportunity. It's a compelling, inspiring perspective that has spread quickly and is already driving real policy and investment. So buckle up and enjoy. Hi, Leah. Welcome to Invested in Climate.
Thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here.
It's great to have you here and great to have a chance to learn about your work. You've been working in environmental advocacy for now over 2 decades, and I'm surprised our paths haven't crossed before. Great to finally meet you.
Yeah, I think it's super surprising we haven't crossed paths. I mean, we've probably been in some of the same rooms yelling about the same problems for quite a few years now. So I'm glad we're fixing that today.
Amazing. Leah, the work of your organization, GoodPower, well, it spans many things I'm interested in. And so we will have a lot to cover. Before we dive into your focus today, will you tell us a bit about the organization's history, as I believe its evolution provides some really interesting context. How did the group get started and what was it initially focused on?
Yeah, well, we were founded almost 20 years ago. So in 2008, and it was our founder and still our board chair, Michael Haas, his son, Matthias, came home from school and said, "Dad, what are we doing about climate change? I'm really worried about it. I learned about it in school." And that conversation sort of changed the trajectory for Mike. He founded the organization, and it was really at that time when we first started. I mean, climate was such a fringe issue, but we focused on young people, and it was around education, organizing, helping them really understand climate and energy solutions, and to give them a sense of agency and self-efficacy that they could have an impact on driving forward those solutions.
Amazing. So educating young people was, let's call it phase 1. What was the next phase and how did it come about?
Sure. Well, I think then reality hit. It was very soon into our mission that we had this realization that awareness is really important and it's necessary, but it's absolutely insufficient to be able to advance sweeping policies or to, change culture around how people think about climate solutions and are those accessible. So we very quickly started incorporating work into campaigns and elections and policies and narrative battles. And it was our own crash course in really understanding how to build power for solutions. And so we started to incorporate that kind of advocacy and organizing pretty early on.
Amazing. And last year, 2025, you rebranded from Action for Climate Emergency to GoodPower. That's a pretty big shift. And for those of us focused on climate communications, it makes sense for many reasons. But I'd love to hear what happened behind the scenes and why the new brand better fits your purpose and your role today.
Yeah, well, I mean, gosh, the easy answer is honestly, it's just easier to inspire people when you're not starting with the word emergency. I think that falls into the sort of quote unquote alarmist trap. I think Action for the Climate Emergency was really accurate. I just don't think first the best entry point. It wasn't really effective anymore. It kind of sounded like a warning. I think people are already really overwhelmed with sort of warnings. And we needed a name that reflected where the world is going. I think something more hopeful and positive, a bigger tent that we can all sort of get under in a more unified name, not just what we're trying to avoid, which is climate chaos. So I think for us, the overwhelming thing we've seen in polling, but election cycle after election cycle, is like the economy just isn't working for the vast majority of people. And we actually think that the energy transition, decarbonization, all of these climate and energy solutions can be kind of this, almost like an economic renaissance for the middle class, that it can actually, that sort of abundance mindset, it can bring economic security and jobs and predictability into our energy bills and all sorts of good things that people want and really vote on consistently, even young people. Economy was the number one issue in 2024 for them. So I think this is really just responsive, especially in this sort of not just a US, but a global cost of living crisis that we find ourselves in.
So it's really interesting. And in some ways, GoodPower's evolution reflects how our society, our culture, and economy have changed. What would you say is the core problem that you're working to solve today?
For us, we think the energy transition or decarbonization of the power sector and transportation and industry, we think these are inevitable. I think the market momentum is just too strong. I mean, just look this last month because of the Iran war. I think it was in the UK, I read an article, 84% increase in 1 month for EV adoptions, and heat pumps doubled. So it's happening because people don't want to import this volatility into their lives, right? And there's this risk that oil and gas have and the perils of that versus, the wind and the sun don't actually have a fuel cost. So I think for us, it's how do we get there more quickly? We think the end is there. We see our role is how do we remove bottlenecks and accelerate, right? Time is kind of our greatest enemy in this work. At least that's how we see it. And how do we save time to seize the opportunity and get there quicker, all the benefits, but also avoid the perils and the consequences as well.
I think that's really interesting is that part of the focus and the switch of focus is in some ways from protecting the environment to focusing on building renewable energy. Is that a fair characterization? I think I remember an early presentation that I saw from the ACE team that showed the burping cows and was like explaining climate change and holistic big picture. And now it seems much more targeted really around renewable energy.
Yeah, well, our strategic plan lays out our strategy through the end of the decade. And I think anywhere we can find emissions, where do the major emissions come from? It's the power sector. It's hard to abate industry. It's transportation, where we've done a ton of work on how do we sort of increase the uptake of e-mobility solutions, two-wheelers in some of the global places we work, but electric vehicles, et cetera. And then the power sector, how do we actually transform how we use power? So we're definitely very invested in the power sector, but also agriculture and all these other verticals where we're going to find lots of emissions that just cannot make their way into the atmosphere as far as we're concerned.
Well, I'm glad that you mentioned your strategic plan. It's published on on your website, and I thought it was actually a really fun and dynamic read. It's presented in a really easy and accessible way, but still really creatively. Let's double click on the priorities that you present. First is to shift culture at scale. That's a big goal, and it's actually one that I think about a lot. How are you approaching culture change?
It is a big question. I mean, this is essentially what we're best at, I would say. Like if you ask somebody that knows about formerly ACE and now GoodPower and sort of what we're good at, it's operating within culture. So the creator economy. We were early adopters of that. We launched our in-house creator marketing agency way back in 2020. It's 6 years old at this point. People don't trust the internet anymore. They don't trust brands. They don't trust corporations, but they trust each other. So when we think about culture change, how do we get people in one affinity group to talk about the benefits of all these solutions to other people in that affinity group? So like rural to rural, conservative to conservative, Gen Z to Gen Z. We find, and we do our own empirical research, but partner with lots of other research groups, that is the most effective way to get people on board who maybe don't see these solutions as helpful. They might see them as a threat. They might see them as a political statement or like not for them. The best way, like I'm from a rural community, to reach my parents who are still in the house I grew up in. My dad is a climate denier, but he loves solar because his HVAC guy told him he could save a lot of money. So I think that's really the key and foundation to kind of all of the work we do in culture is through storytelling and testing that theory. And every single time it works for us.
I'd love to double click on the creator economy that you're supporting and some of what you've learned about helping creators that are trying to drive change through the media that they're creating. What have you learned? What are some of the biggest struggles that you see, and what are you hoping you're able to change?
I don't think this is news to anyone that climate communicators aren't super sexy and exciting. Like people don't actually love climate policy. And when we water it down and over test things, and then they're kind of boiled down to their lowest common denominator, that actually doesn't work on the modern internet. If you put that message out and it's not culturally salient and it's not tied to trends or the news cycle or how people are experiencing the world, you're going to have to pay ad money for every single impression on that content. You're not going to get any organic or viral uptake. So I think the way that we've kind of cracked the code by working and heavily investing in creators, influencers have their own niche markets. We're not partnering with like Taylor Swift or these huge macro creators. We're partnering with these micro creators that might maybe have 1 million, 2 million, 3 million followers, and they have a niche following in makeup or food or fashion or sports or cars or money-saving trends and hacks is a big one that we see. Gaming, we're big on Twitch and the gaming streaming platform. So finding people who are consuming this content and have this like loyal allegiance to these creators that they really trust. I call it the raisin bread theory, that the bread is the makeup influencer talking about makeup. And then it's the raisins of like, okay, occasionally when they're putting on that makeup, they're talking about how silly it is that we're still hooked on these fuels and we're importing this volatility into our bills. And like, wouldn't it be better if we switched and had homegrown energy and got out of this chaos of this hamster wheel that we're in? So that's kind of our theory. It's like, give people what they want. It's the entertainment and joy of experiencing the internet, and slip that message within culture, operate within culture. And that's kind of really worked for us.
I bet that you're working with some folks that would be surprising to us. And I think it's worth giving a couple of shout outs. I love the makeup example, surprising, something that people might not be aware of. But any other creators that we should turn people on to or just use as examples to make it a bit more tangible?
Yeah, I think the big one that was sort of a plot twist for us is we work with a ton of rural and agricultural creators. And we hear, we track these disinformation clusters around, seeking to sort of scare people that renewables aren't a good thing. The latest one we saw last week was that solar is a Chinese psyop and that your solar panels are spying on you and collecting information. That was a big one. We have this one around property rights where we have governments basically saying farmers can't do what they want with their own land. And farmers organically are like, wait a second, I want to be able to farm 600 acres of solar along with my 3,000 acres of corn and soybeans. And that's going to be a really reliable crop in droughts and floods. And I need that resilience to be able to keep my family farm. So I would say like this underdog of agricultural and rural communities that are standing up and saying, look, I'm actually really scared that private equity is coming from my land. I don't want to have an Amazon logistics warehouse by my land. I don't want my farm to fail. And these investments have been kind of an economic lifeline, I think, to a lot of communities. And telling those stories, super undertold. If you look at the national news, that's not what you see. You see that, there's all this political fighting over renewables or oil and gas. But when you actually go to these communities, people have like these incredibly positive stories, these harrowing stories to tell around what this infrastructure is meant for them as individuals, their families, their communities.
Leah, culture change often gets discredited in some ways as immeasurable, as sort of fluffy. And it strikes me that you probably, as an organization, have a lot of pressure to create measurable results. And I'm curious if you've been able to quantify any of the impact that you've had in working with creators or doing other things to impact culture.
Yeah, I do think for a long time in sort of the quote unquote climate movement.
Leah, when it comes to laying the cultural groundwork for renewable energy, which is what you're doing in many ways, in some ways you're trying to depoliticize it. And depoliticizing issues is not easy, especially in such a divisive environment. What have you learned through this work that might be interesting or helpful to others?
Yeah, I mean, I think first of all, when you go into communities like we do and really partner with people and really understand their stories, having utility scale renewable energy in their community, it's not a political statement, right? It's a paycheck. It's something that they rely on. And I mean, I think if you go into that same community and you start talking about climate, you've already lost probably half the room. So I think the messaging really matters. And I like to say the message actually is the messenger. So if you're finding other adjacent communities, farmers, county commissioners, fire chiefs, teachers, people who already have this infrastructure in their community. And if you show those positive stories to communities considering this infrastructure, it pretty much wins every time. So I think what we see as you move further and further locally from this national rhetoric we're hearing, the story is so positive and in a pretty chaotic and unpredictable time for communities where there's all sorts of drivers that are making it more difficult for farmers to keep their farms in their families for generations. This is something that does feel predictable and does feel like, okay, well, I have a long-term lease. And when things get tough for me, I'm going to be able to rely on this. So I think there's a real difference in what we're seeing sort of nationally in the news cycle and what we're seeing locally. I will say one really notable thing. There's been a lot of great press recently on really elevating this story that Republicans nationally are not opposed, especially to solar. A majority of Republicans in our own poll we just did with U of Chicago, but also Tony Fabrizio, famous Trump pollster, Kellyanne Conway recently did a poll showing that a majority of Republicans do support developing large-scale solar. That is an undertold story, and we need to talk about that more. This is bipartisan. It shares bipartisan support, even from voters who voted to elect Donald Trump.
Well, this is a great segue to the second pillar of your strategic plan. So moving from culture to actually building political power in the US. Will you share a quick overview of this pillar of your work?
For us, it's really about education, right? How do we, first of all, increase the denominator of the election, which is a big area of work that we do at GoodPower. The denominator, the electorate, right? How do you change that? You get more people involved in participating in our democracy. So voter registration, for example, we've been investing in greatly since 2018. And, 2020, we grew, 2022, 2024, 2026 will be the biggest year we've had yet. For us, how do we get the most marginalized voters that have the least information about the energy transition, how it affects their daily life, the economic potential if we invest in these solutions? How do we connect them to information and how does it touch them? Thinking about utility bills. That's on the ballot this year. We look at the SRP election we just had in Arizona. We look at the Georgia PSC race, huge turn of events there, Virginia, New Jersey. I never thought I'd actually see these headlines in my lifetime where utility bills have become this kitchen table issue. I think it's absolutely fascinating. And voters are becoming aware and savvy, again, because it's one of those economic pain points that I think is really just unpredictable. Our bills shouldn't be going up and down like the stock market. People want control. They want to know. They want predictability. Okay, next month, is this going to be consistent? Am I going to have enough money to pay for this? And so I think we're really seeing that play out this cycle as we head to November.
That's exciting because we've heard for a long time that voters generally have a preference for climate action and that they care about clean water and clean air and protecting land where it's near them, but that those preferences don't often turn into priorities, that it's not typically a top voting issue. And what you're saying is that it's become so costly because of rising fuel prices, because of rising utility prices, that it actually is rising to the top and will become something that really drives elections. At the same time, I don't hear politicians talking that much about it yet. And so I'm curious, is that coming? Is that part of the discourse that we should expect? Or do you feel like this still feels like a way to scare voters away for politicians, is talking too much about climate?
Yeah, I mean, this is the age-old debate that we're seeing play out in Washington right now. Do we say climate? Do we not say climate to inspire participation to advance policies eventually that will help us avert the consequences of climate change? We think that's a false dichotomy. We think it's both. I think there are a tremendous amount of voters in 2024, actually 8% of young people, which is a lot of voters, young people under 35, rated climate as the number one voting issue for them in 24. So with that audience, we should be talking about climate. That's the sophisticated segmentation strategy we should have. For the majority of voters, though, they actually rated the economy. It was all about money. And the most recent Pew Research study around sort of voting priorities for Americans, the top 5 were either about money or healthcare or money to pay for healthcare. It was very connected to the economic concerns. So what I think we're going to see is two sides of the coin where how do we nest climate for candidates who want to talk about climate, and that's just something they feel bold about and want to do, and that's, their base supports that. I think we're going to see them nest it within, okay, rising insurance premiums because of climate disasters. You're connecting those two issues for voters. Oh, energy bills? Well, if we reduce our dependence on oil and gas and built homegrown energy in the form of wind, solar, and storage, the first thing you said, well, voters may prioritize climate and care about it. When you look at how they prioritize all the other issues, it generally falls below your basic quality of life, economic security, having healthcare for my family, job security. Those things are going to outperform climate, which can feel kind of like a luxury to worry about in times like this when people are experiencing this cost of living crisis.
Leah, shortly before the last federal election, we did an episode with the Environmental Voter Project. And I learned something really interesting that, yes, there's a large number of young people who rank climate as their number one top issue, but half of them don't vote. And so Environmental Voter Project's approach is go get those people to vote, is that anyone that cares about the environment and lists that as their top issue, give them the confidence that they should vote, or more likely create the social pressure of actually people like you vote, your neighbors are voting, to change the social norm for them of actually you should be voting. What's your approach? Is it about encouraging people that care about climate to be more likely to become voters? Or is it about connecting the economy and other issues that voters already care about to environmental priorities? Or how is it that you're really working to gain power?
Oh, 100%. It has to be all of the above. And we have to be able to walk and chew gum. You're going to have reasonably high propensity or likely voters. And it's really about nesting these issues within the issues they care about, right? And getting them out to vote on them. And then you're going to have people that are extremely low propensity or very marginalized, very little access to the ballot. You need to invest in things like voter registration. I'm a huge fan of Environmental Voter Project and Nathaniel Stinnett and all the work that they're doing. And it's increasing the denominator, right? If we look at the restrictive voter ID laws, if we look at I just read a paper on this, the $1 billion since 2020 that has come from think tanks to prevent people from voting, right? Getting rid of early vote on Sundays in southern states when many Black people vote. These are modern voter suppression tactics. And I think we have to be really honest about that. So there's the mechanics and the logistics of in every state it's different, right? In my state, I can register same day at my polls. That's not true for Texas, for example. So really understanding how do we facilitate participation and investing in things like voter registration, voter education around how do you find your polling place? What are the registration deadlines? Is there early vote? Can I vote by mail? It's a very complex process, especially for a young person. I remember showing up on election day. I grew up in Wisconsin, had no clue you had to register first. And luckily, I lived in a same-day registration state and could still vote. So there's a big barrier of just information on accessing the ballot. And I do agree with Nathaniel. I think that it is overrepresented in young people, this worry about the future and about the economy, but about climate and about all sorts of other values-based issues that I think are really, really top of the list for young people uniquely. Facilitating their access to the ballot, I think, is the key here. And how do we remove barriers and sort of reverse and fight against some of the very restrictive, policies or, frankly, modern voter suppression tactics that are standing in their way?
Leah, the economic benefits of renewable energy has been a constant theme in our conversation and in your work. And so it's not surprising that the final pillar of your strategy is to build a good economy for all. What does building a good economy for all mean, and how are you working to achieve it?
The basic gist here is that the economy isn't working for most people. And I think we exist to change that. We think the key is that accelerating a world that sort of seizes what we think is the greatest economic opportunity in generations. Like in my lifetime, we may not see an economic opportunity as great as what we're seeing. Just even last year, aside from the sort of the US federal headwinds we're seeing here with this current administration, just over 92% of all new power generation in the world last year was renewable. This stuff is technology forward. It's sexy. It's revolutionary. We just gotta get out and seize this opportunity. And it's going to result in what we think is this economic renaissance for the middle class, which is evaporating, not just in the US, but we work in Brazil and South Africa and the UK and British Columbia, Canada. This is not a US problem. The middle class is disappearing, the rich are getting richer, and those struggling economically are having a harder time. And it's harder and harder to sort of access that economic security. We think decarbonization is the key to all of that. If you go to any rural community in the United States that's brought utility scale wind, solar, or storage into the community, these developers invest in long-term leases. They get property tax revenue. Oftentimes, farmers get better access roads to their farms. Sometimes entire schools are donated. They invest in cattle auctions and cultural festivals and communities being able to set their terms and say, look, come build here. We want all of the economic benefits, and here's our terms to do it. This is what we really need as a community. I think there's a really generational opportunity to kind of revitalize communities that, like the one I grew up in, where lots of young people leave and they go to the cities and they don't feel like that's a place that they can access opportunity. I think accelerating decarbonization checks the box in all of those areas. And at the same time, the perils of continuing as we've been operating with our energy system, I think that's playing out. If we look at the war in Iran, look how sick and tired people are all over the world, Europe, the US, all over the world at importing that volatility into their households. People don't want to be beholden to geopolitical conflicts and this global risk or exposure or volatility that oil and gas have. They want certainty. They want control. They want energy freedom. Decarbonized power and decarbonization of transportation, right? Nobody's like going to the gas pump right now feeling very good about filling up their car. They don't want that. Now you can charge at home sometimes for a couple bucks overnight. That sounds pretty good to me when people are in the midst of this cost of living crisis. So how do we frame these things and connect the dots for people? That's really why we exist. And I think it's all about unlocking this economic renaissance.
I'd love to hear more. It sounds like a really productive, important part of your work. Can we double click and hear more about the tactics that you're using and how you're approaching this idea of accelerating renewable energy and opening up an economy that works for all?
Yeah. So going under the hood a little bit, we currently in the UK and the US, we run about 200 siting and permitting campaigns in 36 US states and all over the UK. And what's happening right now, I'm not sure how familiar you are with sort of the development life cycle. Like, how do you get a utility scale solar or battery energy storage or wind project built? From finding the site to the permitting to the engineering and construction and procurement and operations, et cetera. Permitting is the most risky and also the longest period within the development cycle. It's very fraught. Right now, according to researchers, 1 out of 3 projects is canceled. When there are delays and cancellations, it costs these developers like $200,000 per megawatt in sunk costs. Oftentimes, what happens is these projects, depending on the state, my state of Wisconsin, these projects are permitted at the Public Service Commission level, so it's a state process. Many states in the U.S. actually permit at a county level, so it's a county commission and the zoning board that make the decision, yay or nay, are we going to issue this permit or not? And what's been happening is some of the disinformation that I mentioned, these disinformation clusters that we're tracking and we're trying to actually overcome that are designed to just scare people that solar panels are spying on you. This infrastructure will crash your property values. Solar panels are now leaking chemicals that will give you cancer. These outright lies that are being spread all across rural America intended to frighten people to the point where they come out and say, hey, county commissioners, don't issue this permit. Or, hey, Public Service Commission, don't issue this permit. We exist, all the campaigns we run actually exist to find the supporters and to educate people authentically with stories of other communities that have already done this, right? Hey, it's like rating a hotel on TripAdvisor, right? Okay, 8 out of 10 stars. The food was but the pool was great and I would go back. It's kind of the same thing. Like what's the good, bad, and ugly? What does a neighboring county in Oklahoma have to say about wind or solar? Hearing from people who have actually done it and are living with this infrastructure and are looking at it every day, that is the best and most authentic messenger that we can elevate to convince other communities. And that's really what our strategy is. We run these micro campaigns all around the country to turn not in my backyard or NIMBY into yes in my backyard, YIMBY. Actually, now that I've been educated, I would welcome this infrastructure as long as we do it this way and we really look at what the community needs and we're investing in those needs. That's what we're doing specifically around the permitting fights. And we're really trying to get as many of these projects permitted and through to construction and operational as possible.
Leah, I've really appreciated how focused and pragmatic your strategic plan is. And all of it makes a lot of sense. I'm sure that as you were developing it, there were some really important things that didn't make the cut that feel really important and that you see are critical to achieving actually the big goals that you're working on. And I'm curious, what else needs to happen beyond what you're able to focus on for your core strategy? What else are you either partnering with others or hope that others pick up because you see it's essential for making progress?
I think we're seeing a major transition right now in the nonprofit sector writ large, but certainly in groups that focus on climate and energy and sort of adjacent issues in the environment. I think the number one piece of advice for myself and for GoodPower, but also the broader field of practitioners out there, is we cannot rely solely on philanthropy. We need to figure out ways to, through investments or planned giving or earned income related to our missions, we need to diversify how we support our organizations. We're seeing a huge transition right now, I think also in philanthropy, where the money just isn't moving like it used to. And so I think my greatest advice is let's work on being less reliant on just philanthropy and being really creative around how we fund these strategies, finding investors, professionalizing your staff. That's the number one thing we did at GoodPower years ago was how do we not act like a nonprofit necessarily, but how do we act like a really professionalized, almost an agency, a research lab, an advocacy organization that's a level up in terms of the professionalized staff that we have. And I think when we can start attracting investment from people who also are stakeholders in driving forward decarbonization across agriculture and transportation and power, et cetera, I think that's when we really win. The time is short. We can't do everything. So we really, really need, I think, to harness more revenue and unlock new revenue sources and not be completely reliant on philanthropy. I think we need to break through that.
This has been a really inspiring conversation, and I'm sure there's some listeners now trying to figure out how they can be more helpful. What do you think? What should people who want to do more do?
Oh gosh, I think definitely don't try to tackle everything. I think it's really overwhelming thinking about the blockade and the roadblocks right now, particularly around renewable energy deployment with the passage of the One Big Beautiful Bill. Picking a lane, I think people that I've come across and even my own background, where people feel the most sense of self-efficacy and passion is locally. I have a data center, for example, in my county that's going in. We're trying really hard to get that powered with renewable energy, right? So local organizing, who are your local elected officials, your city councilors, your county commissioners, who's on your public service commission, being involved locally and really talking to your community, your friends, your family about this economic potential of the energy transition and then going out and showing up. I think that's what we really need. Don't sit this one out. This is going to benefit all of us. I think also on the sort of policy accountability, we're in a major election year. And I think often we put so much effort into let's get out the vote, let's get people to vote. And then less effort after Election Day, whether it's Democrats or Republicans, the accountability of getting an agenda moving after, what happens the day after the election. I think more emphasis and investment and attention on that. How are we positioning ourselves as people, as organizations, to be able to have that accountability moment of holding people to their campaign promises? We cannot lift our foot off the pedal. We really need to accelerate.
Leah, thank you so much for this conversation and all the amazing work that you're doing.
Yeah, thanks for having me here. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Invested in Climate. Please remember to rate us on Apple, Spotify, or Google. Find show notes, sign up for updates, get in touch, and visualize your climate action at investedinclimate.com. This podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes only and does not constitute financial, accounting, or legal advice. Thanks again.